God is not often glorified by His children who are quick to defend themselves. But I tell you what, God is often glorified when He comes to the defense of His people. Item by item, and you can see how every point, at every turn, Jesus' trial was an absolute violation of everything this system was based upon. Jesus stood trial in what was probably, perhaps we could say, the most unjust, the greatest perversion of justice ever to happen. Especially when we consider who it was that was on trial. Now, all of that is to say, that gives us a good sort of background to think about Jesus' standing trial. Now, so with that in mind, let's now look to John chapter 18, beginning from verse 19. In John chapter 18, where this begins in the home of Annas, in the middle of the night. Jesus is arrested at some point after sundown on Thursday, or some point in the early morning hours of Friday, what we would call morning hours. By the Jewish means of counting time, it was already Friday when the sun went down. But by our estimation, it was either in the late hours of Thursday or the early morning hours of Friday that Jesus was arrested. So remember how all that happened. They come, Judas comes, there's the kiss. Jesus had just been praying and everything. His disciples couldn't stay awake. The Roman army's there. They say, Jesus says, who are you here for? They say, Jesus the Nazarene. And Jesus says, I am. Clearly a reference back to Exodus chapter 3. I am that I am. Jesus says, I am. They all fall back. Jesus asks them again, who are you here for? They say, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus says, I'm Him. I told you. Now let all these others go. So they sort of flee, but then there's the sword. Peter cuts off the ear. Jesus heals the ear. Then Jesus is bound. They bind Jesus. The disciples flee for the most part. Peter and John sort of get a little bit of a courage back, and they follow at a distance, and they lead Jesus away. All of that brings us to John chapter 18 and verse 19, because they lead Jesus away to the house of Annas. Now, who is this man Annas? Annas, we're told, was the high priest. However, we need to understand a little bit about the high priest in Jesus' day. The high priest was supposed to be the high priest for life. However, that wasn't the case anymore. It's a long, convoluted story that we won't go through how that all came about. But suffice to say, somewhere about Solomon's time, Solomon was the first one to depose a high priest and put somebody else in place. But by the time the exile was over, Israel seemed to have adopted the practice that the high priest wasn't high priest for life anymore. But along came the Romans. And the Romans want to make sure that nobody gets enough power to be dangerous. So the Romans make sure that the high priest isn't high priest very long. They make sure that it gets changed up. So along comes this man Annas. Annas was high priest about 2 decades before this story. He was high priest for about half a dozen years. But since the time he was high priest, 5 of his sons have been high priest, and now his son-in-law is high priest, another man by the name of Caiaphas. So Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas, and he's the 6th son, the 6th relative of Annas to serve as high priest in a row after Annas. So even though the Romans have sort of broken this up, clearly Annas is still in control. He's not officially the high priest, but he's called the high priest because guess what? He really is, even though his son-in-law is the high priest. You kind of get the picture. Now, when we think about Annas, the picture I want you to put in your mind is the perfect picture. Marlon Brando in The Godfather. Because that is who Annas is. He's this elderly man, maybe in his 70s or 80s. And he is just like the family mafia boss. He's got it all wrapped up. This is a family business. He is corrupt as they come. And he is as wealthy as they come. And he's wealthy because mainly of two reasons. First of all, he's wealthy because of the temple money. Because whenever you went to the temple, the Jews had to put an offering. They understood part of their salvation was to give alms to the poor. But in the temple, you had to give temple money. You couldn't throw some piece of Roman money in the temple offering. You had to put Jewish shekels. Where did you get those? Because they weren't in wide circulation in Jesus' day. Where did you get those? Well, guess what? There was a handy-dandy money exchange in the temple. And the money was exchanged from Roman coinage to Hebrew coinage for a fee. A hefty fee, but for a fee. And all of that money went to the high priests. And it made them wealthy. So when Jesus, that Tuesday morning, just a couple of days prior to this, that Tuesday morning, when Jesus put his hand on the first money changer's table, that's when his fate was sealed. I mean, we know his plan was sealed before the foundation of the world, but in a human sense, in an earthly sense, his fate was sealed when he turned over that first money changer's table. Why? Because that was Annas' table. I don't think Annas really cared what Jesus taught. He cared about his money. And Jesus, when he turned that table over, got between Annas and his money. Which he did on purpose, by the way. That's why Jesus did that. Because Jesus wants to be convicted. Don't think of Jesus as this person on trial who's hoping they'll be found innocent. Jesus has brought all this about because he now desires to be found guilty. That's why he turned over the money changer's table. So that was one way. The other way that the priests made money was through the sacrifices. Because when you came to the temple, there had to be sacrifices. Passover lambs. There was the twice a day sacrifices that took place. Doves, all kinds of animals were sacrificed. And guess what? The scripture tells us those sacrifices have to be without blemish. And guess who decided if they were without blemish or not? The priests. And by the way, the temple also had their own flocks and their own doves and their own animals. Just in case somebody was there to offer sacrifice that didn't pass muster. The temple had their own flocks of sheep and dove and all the sacrifices that were approved. Guess what? They were approved by the priests. And you could buy one. If you came with a lamb and, you just had the unfortunate circumstance that your lamb wasn't approved by the priest, well then, fortunately you could buy the temple's lamb at an upcharge. Kind of like, who's ever been at the airport and had to eat something? Kind of like that. Where you pay $12 for a cold sandwich because you have to, because you're a prisoner. That's kind of like this. You were a prisoner in the temple. You had to sacrifice, and it had to be a sacrifice the priest approved of, and, well, somehow they only approved of their own animals. And so eventually nobody even brought their own lambs because everybody knew. You're going to have to buy the temple's lamb. So those two things made Annas and his family staggeringly wealthy, unbelievably corrupt, Marlon Brando level corrupt. He's the family, make you an offer you can't refuse, family business kind of guy. Now that you got the picture of Annas in mind, let's begin from verse 19. So Jesus is brought bound to his house in the middle of the night. The high priest then questioned Jesus, meaning the high priest here is referring to Annas. What this is this is the first trial that Jesus undergoes. And the purpose of this trial, as we'll see, is to find something to charge Jesus of. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. What's going on there is Annas is trying to find something to charge him with, which wasn't the Sanhedrin's job. They didn't charge anybody. They evaluated charges that were brought to them. They didn't bring charges to anybody. But this is what Annas is doing. What can we charge him? We got to charge him with something, because we're told they had already decided they were going to put him to death. They just had to figure out what they're going to put him to death for. So they come and they question Jesus about his teaching. Verse 20, Jesus answered them, I have spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. In contrast to this secret trial by night, by cover of night in Annas' house, Jesus says, well, everything I taught was in the open, in the public. Everybody heard me. So what Jesus is essentially saying to Annas is, let's do this the right way. I cannot incriminate myself, but I'm given the right to defend myself, so call some witnesses. You want to know about my teaching? Call witnesses that heard my teaching. Let's do this the right way. Verse 22, when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? So this is in fulfillment, of course, of Micah chapter 5, verse 1. With a rod, they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. This is the beginning of Jesus' physical maltreatment. Perhaps he was treated roughly after he was bound and brought in. That's entirely likely. But this is the first blow that we read about. And this is the first of many. Jesus' physical mistreatment is well known to us. This was the beginning of it here. Notice what Peter says. He was reviled, and he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. They strike him for answering in such a way. Verse 23, Jesus answered them, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So Annas is not able to come up with a charge. He asks Jesus some questions, doesn't really get anything that he can use. So he then sends him to Caiaphas. What's Caiaphas been doing in the meantime? In the meantime, Caiaphas has been going around waking up the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night to come in and take part of this trial. But as we'll see, he's only waking up selective members of the Sanhedrin. He's not waking them all up. He's waking up selective members of the Sanhedrin, and he's collecting them at his house, which is part of the same palace. So Annas gets done questioning him. Annas sort of hits a block in the road, sends him bound over to Caiaphas, his son-in-law. It's at that point that we switch over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew picks up the events of this night at that point. Matthew skips over the initial sort of arraignment type of a trial. He skips over that and just cuts to the second trial that Jesus endures that night, beginning from verse 57. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 57. Then those who had seized Jesus, meaning the temple guards, the palace guards, they led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Caiaphas had woken them up in the night, gathered everybody. We've got Jesus. We need to get together. We need to convict him. Remember, a trial could not take place on a feast day. A trial had to take place during the day. And a trial could not take place in a private place. It had to be in a public place. All of those things are violated here. Verse 58, and Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest. And going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. This is not a trial. We all know that they weren't looking for the truth. Plainly, Matthew says their purpose is to find a reason that they can put him to death. They've already decided to put him to death. The purpose of this now is to find some sort of reason to put him to death. They're seeking false witnesses. These false witnesses, by the way, should have immediately had what done to them? Put to death themselves. all of these false witnesses that we read are brought forth, all of them should have been put to death because their testimony was false and seeking to put someone else to death. Verse 60, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. So that's kind of like what Jesus said. That's referencing all the way back to the beginning of Jesus' ministry in John 2. When Jesus said something along those lines, but he said, not, I will destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days, but he said, you will destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And then John goes on to tell us, and Jesus was talking about his body. Jesus was saying, because he's answering, they say, give us a sign, Jesus, give us a sign. Jesus says, here's your sign. You will destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. That's your sign. So they take that and, this happened 3 years ago. And they twist it and they pervert it and they bring it out and they say, well, we heard him say that he's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And Mark goes on to tell us, and even then their testimony didn't agree. They couldn't agree on where Jesus said it, when he said it, what the circumstances was. They couldn't even agree on what Jesus said. Didn't matter. Didn't matter because they've got an agenda and the agenda is to put him to death. Jesus, by the way, I'm convinced he said that in order to give them something later to convict him of. Because again, he wants to be convicted. And so I think Jesus, they said, give us a sign. Jesus says, okay, here you go. And what he really meant is, here's something for you to use later on when you need to use something. By the way, this is also the charge they brought against Stephen. They said that Stephen believes in this guy, Jesus is that guy who said he's going to destroy the temple. They brought the same charge against Paul, etc., and that sort of thing. Now, Jesus, of course, didn't say that. He said something close to that, but it didn't matter. They bring this charge against him anyway, which even if Jesus had said that, they're bringing a charge against Jesus of making the threat to destroy the temple, which wasn't a crime. There's nothing to convict him. Even if Jesus said that, there was nothing to convict him of, because all he did was make this threat to destroy the temple. The only thing that you could say under the Jewish criminal justice system, the only thing that you could say that would bring you a conviction was blasphemy. And you guessed it, that's where they're going to go. Continue reading verse 62. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remained silent. Here we see just this amazing, persistent silence of Jesus before his accusers. We think, of course, of the prophet Isaiah, who said, like a sheep before his shearers was silent. They reviled him. They scorned him. They scandalized him, but he remained silent. The persistent silence of Jesus. Do you know how hard it is to remain silent when someone is bringing allegations against you, particularly that are false? You know how hard that is to keep quiet? Especially when those allegations are untrue and you could easily refute them. You could conclusively refute them. Do you know how hard that is to remain silent? These accusations against Jesus were wildly untrue and could have been easily and conclusively refuted once and for all. Yet Jesus remains silent. I pray that God would give to us, his people, this same type of meekness that allows us to remain silent when we too are scandalized, when we too are slandered. A friend told me this a long time ago, and I've tried to remember this. When you are accused by the enemies of God, only one person can defend you. Only one person will defend you. Either you or God. And if you won't let God defend you, he won't push you out of the way to do it. And so one of the hard things for us as children of God to learn is to let God come to our defense. God is not often glorified by his children who are quick to defend themselves. But I tell you what, God is often glorified when he comes to the defense of His people. That's a hard thing to learn, and I'm spending a lifetime trying to learn that myself. But that is biblical, that is scriptural, and this is our model. Jesus, who was reviled and insulted and degraded in such ridiculous ways, remained silent before His accusers.